Hello, welcome to Struggles of the Spirit. I'm your host and interviewer, the Reverend Leland Udell. I'm glad you've tuned into our program again today. We're still looking at the subject of healing from different points of view. It's a huge subject, and lots can be said about it. And to help facilitate that today, I have the Rabbi James Glazier here from Temple Sinai, who's going to talk about the subject. And remember, this is a phone-in program. We are live, as you know. This is not pre-recorded. And so we would like you to call us at any time during our conversations. Our phone number is 264-2255. 264-2255. Please don't be bashful about phoning in. You don't have to be as wise as Moses to phone in, or astute, or just whatever's on your mind that our program brings up to the surface, and you'd like some feedback or comment. Please give us a ring. We really like to get phone calls. They help make the show more alive and more interactive. I know you're watching it, and a lot of people tell me that they enjoy the show, but I don't hear those comments live as we're broadcasting, only after the fact. So please call us and participate with us. So Jim, it's great to have you back here again.
Thank you.
It really is, and I'm glad you were free to be here again today.
It's a pleasure to be back.
So it's as I said a minute ago, it's a broad subject on healing. How would you like to look at it? It's your call, because it's so open-ended.
It is very open-ended in terms of healing. When you first asked me to speak on your show, and I appreciate the offer, the invitation, I thought of the miracle of the human body to begin with, its capacity to recover both physically and mentally. The challenge that we have is the patients sometimes require to allow ourselves to heal. In our own society today, we're such in a hurry to get things done so quickly, but yet healing has its own pace. It has its own schedule, and while we may be impatient, the body functions without necessarily our guidance or our direction. It has a spirit, if you will, unto itself. So there's that component of healing. And when I think about the human body, I'm reminded of the prayer that we often say in the morning in our worship, that we thank God for the wonder of the human body and for its incredible functioning, how there is a connection of arteries and veins, and there are valves, and there are conduits, and there are pumps, and there are just so many parts of the human body that not only help us function, but also can recuperate when we are ill or in need of health. And this is true for the mind as well, that the mind often has times of crisis, of illness, and it too requires time and patience for its recovery. So that's one component of healing, clearly. The miracle, the gift of the human body and spirit and mind, that has an enormous capacity of healing itself. I was also mindful of of God's gift to us to bring about healing, that it's not just the body itself left to its own device, but we ourselves can be agents of healing. So one could ask, well, how could that be? Well, we have been given intellect, and some of us have pursued careers in the healing arts, be it doctors or nurses, chiropractors, massage therapists, social workers, psychiatrists, psychologists in the healing arts to help facilitate human healing. And then finally, even for those who are not necessarily in the profession of healing, but nevertheless, the people amongst whom we live, the friends and family, caregivers, trusted individuals, communities, faith communities, can also bring healing. So we're rich with the opportunity for healing. And who has not walked through life and not been scarred, either physically or mentally? We've all walked the path of life, and nobody goes through life without being scarred. It's an unusual individual who is able to dance between the raindrops.
I once, in my years of working in hospitals as full-time chaplain, I remember there was one man who, I think he was in his early 60s or late 50s. He was having a bypass, coronary artery bypass surgery, and he was sort of agitated and worried because this was the first time he had ever thought about illness.
Correct.
And I said, haven't you noticed in all your 50-plus years of living that some people die, some people have chronic illnesses, some people never make it to the age of 21, and here you are, almost 60, and with a good prognosis surgically for your condition, and it's as though you just stepped onto the planet for the first time. And he really hadn't, he had completely denied himself any awareness of the some of the life struggle that you and I know so well as a clergy.
Nobody goes through life without scars.
That's for sure.
And it's quite unusual to live a life where you are without some measure of pain or discomfort. That's unfortunate, but it is part of our human condition.
My wife and I were talking about King David, the great King David, who was such a charming young man, and you know, was anointed king, and then became pulled the country together and did all kinds of great things, and then he had this one of his kids called Absalom, who didn't like Dad at all and led a revolt of the people against him, and David had to fight his own son, and ultimately his son was killed, and remember his feeling, Absalom, Absalom, my son, Absalom, after he had been killed, and here the great King David was just in absolute grief, you know, over the death of his son.
Correct.
It was. It's always been a moving story to me.
It's remarkable to me, the will for humankind to go on, given the travail that we often endure in life. But in perspective, at least my perspective, that there is great pain in life, but the joy certainly overshadows that pain. And there are opportunities for service within every human being's life to share with others the pain that they themselves had endured, for two reasons, I think. One, to share that you're not alone, that someone else has gone through exactly what you've gone through, and that your spirit can endure. And two, that by telling the story to someone else, you not only bring them healing and consolation, but you also renew your own sense of survival and healing within yourself. And that can be of such enormous comfort to both the one who is presently suffering and that individual who had gone through the same travail. It's said in our prayer book that someone who has endured suffering can be the greatest counselor of all, because they know when best to speak and not to speak, when to extend a hand and when not to extend a hand, when to be there for them and when not to be there for them, because they themselves know the pain that individual happens to be going through. Not to minimize their pain, but to recognize it and to be empathetic to it.
And such an individual, the way you describe this person, doesn't put down the other individual's pain and need for healing, that they respect what the other person has gone through, and they are supportive of them and don't try to push them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Doesn't minimize pain and doesn't move them through along too fast. It's one of the yins and yangs of our society, if I can speak in general terms. We're more connected than ever, but we're more isolated than ever.
We'll talk about that a little bit.
Well, to a very large extent. I mean, we're more electronically connected than ever. We have answering machines, we have phones, we have cell phones, we have our pagers, we have our laptops, we have our desktops, we have our internet, we have our websites. We have so many ways of communicating to one another, TV, radio, whatever. We are so connected, and yet we're not touching one another. In other words, we're behind a monitor somewhere, and someone else is many miles away, and we're typing words to them or speaking words to them, but we're not in proximity. And this is crucial when we understand community. And I speak within a Jewish context, but I think it's a universal context. I don't think it's unique to Judaism. Many people say, why can't, and I've used this example before on your show, why can't I pray on a golf course? And I say, absolutely, you can pray on a golf course, and there's nothing unauthentic about it. Or you can walk in the woods. This is a beautiful state. People like to commune with nature, and they feel connected to God, and they have spiritual moments. That's fine. But within our community, you can't really understand your mission, your responsibility as a praying person, unless you're in the midst of community. Because what does it mean to say, God, I pray that we can live in a world of peace, or God, I pray that we can live in a world where no one suffers, and yet be detached from the community in which there may be people who lack inner peace, who may lack enough to eat, who may lack a place to live. So there is prayer on a mountaintop, in a lake, in a boat, on a golf course, but it isn't prayer connected to community.
Not enough.
It's not enough. So there are degrees of prayer. In other words, the highest form of prayer is praying with others, to be part of community. For example, at the end of our worship service, we rise for the mourner's prayer. And as Reformed Jews, I'm a Reformed rabbi, as Reformed Jews we all rise because there must be Jews who are no longer remembered because they died in Holocaust or they were martyrs, or so we can stand as a community and face our loss collectively. But in more traditional congregations, the mourner, meaning the one who is there because there was a loved one who died recently or someone whose anniversary of death is being observed, those individuals will rise in the congregation who are related or friends of the person in remembrance. And so, in a sense, they stand in the midst of the community and say this mourner's prayer. And the rest of the community becomes cognizant that they are shouldering a burden that service. And after the service is over, they can go up and say, you know, I knew your husband, or I knew your friend, and he meant a great deal to me. Or even ask, you know, it's been several years. Have you gone through this period of time okay and whole? Are you okay? Just to hug and connect. And that's what I meant by we're more connected than we've ever been, but we're more isolated than we've ever been, because people need those opportunities to say, I'm hurting, can you hug me? Can you be there for me? Do I have a relationship with you where I can lay my soul before you and say, I need help?
friend of mine told me this story today. He's an older gentleman, and he's moved into a new neighborhood, still here in the general Burlington area, but a different community, and bought a house there. And a friend backed into his mailbox and broke the mailbox. He just had surgery himself, so he's not ready to get a post hole digger and
dig a hole
or do any heavy carpentry at all. And lo and behold, the gentleman who lives across the street, who's Spanish and came from Chile, he just says, "I'll fix your mailbox for you." And so he did. And then he explained himself. He said, "I'm from Chile, and in Chile, you help one another." He said, "That's the way it is to be a member of the community, just a general, not religious community necessarily, but the general community in Chile. You are your brother's keeper." And my friend remarked about, this isn't the case in around here anymore. There's no barn raising where the community comes together to put up the barn. It's something that happened in the past, but as you say, we're more isolated. And here, this wonderful man from another country taught us what it means to be a member of a community.
People have a struggle with faith communities, and we're not here to talk about the essence of faith communities.
No, not today.
We're not, but there's an important component to faith community, which I think many people are very frightened by faith communities. And let me explain why.
What do you mean?
God talk frightens people. Theology can frighten people. In Judaism, there are 3 components to a synagogue: educational, spiritual, and social. And you really have to have all 3 components to have a vibrant, thriving congregation. But you can get your educational and your spiritual within the context of your social. So the face of God is seen in the face of individuals. To know humankind is to be learned. And I think what happens when people feel disassociated from religious life, they go, "I don't want all that God talk. I don't want all those guilt feelings. I'm very concerned about going there and being minimalized because I haven't been a member for a long time." When in fact, synagogues, churches, mosques, I presume, have all a strong theological component, but it doesn't necessarily present itself in doctrine at the door. It presents itself in the way people live their lives and conduct themselves in public settings, or even in private settings. And consequently, I think there are a lot of people who are in need of healing, whatever that healing happens to be, who would benefit by having a larger, expanded community. The best part of our service is the social that takes place after the worship component of the service is over. We have 2 parts. We have our worship, and we have what we call our oneg. And it's during the oneg that people really talk to one another and catch up. How was your week?
It's not just a clique.
No, we try to break that down. We have name tags for people. Our board have name tags. Actually, every member has a name tag. They put them on so that if there's a new face, we go toward that new face and say, you're new here. How long have you been here? How are you adjusting? Are you feeling like you're settling in? We try to make that person feel welcome, especially for the newest person. It doesn't always work that way, and we regret it, but we try to make the newest person feel comfortable. A lot of people come to worship because they're praying. And what are they praying for? They're praying for the end of whatever they're suffering. I mean, one of the principles, it's the most difficult time to seek God is when you're in pain, because you're asking more then than ever, and you might not have developed a spiritual relationship with a higher being, and then you're looking for, I can't say payback, that's not the right word, but you're looking for God's intervention in a situation in which interventions may be very subtle, but you want a miracle. And healing doesn't always come through miracles. Healing often will come through slow, gradual interventions. It's not the quick pill. It's the slap on the back. It's the phone call from a person you didn't expect to call. It's the cake that someone baked. It's the doctor with a caring, compassionate heart. It's the medicine that may not take a month to kick in, but might take 5 months to kick in. And it's the community. It's the loving embrace of that community that can bring healing. But people often seek out religion when they're in crisis. It's not always the best time to seek out religion, but is there ever a bad time? I don't think so.
Explain for me along this line, what is sitting Shiva? Is that still practiced in Judaism?
Very much, yes.
Will you tell our public what that means?
Well, the Shiva is the week of mourning following the funeral of a family member. In non-Jewish religions, Christianity, you have what is comparable to a wake.
But that's just an occasion.
But that happens before the funeral takes place.
Right.
People don't normally convene before a Jewish funeral because Jewish funerals are very fast. The death occurs, and normally within 48 hours the funeral takes place. Sometimes even within 24 to 36 hours the funeral will take place. When the funeral is over, the family returns to their home, and they're in a state of grief. They're not really caring about preparing meals, and they're not caring about appearance. They're thinking more in terms of their loss, their enormous loss. Their friends come to feed them, to take care of their house, to sit there with them and listen to them as they explain their grief. And their friends are also there to encourage them and to share with them episodes that they too went through. As I said, someone who's gone through the same experience can often be a great teacher and counselor. And it's also an opportunity for friends to say goodbye, which can be very comforting. Their opportunity to say goodbye to the loved one who has died. You know, I knew this person. I want to tell you how much he meant to me when I worked with him or when we studied together. I want to be able to share with you how much of an impact this person had in my own life. And that can be comforting to the family, to know that the one they have lost wasn't some nobody, but was an individual who impacted and touched lives well beyond the family's comprehension.
It's wonderful that would happen in Judaism. In a lot of Christian contexts, after the actual funeral and placing the body in the ground, or the ashes if there was a cremation, people don't do much with the family in their grief. They don't want to. How can I put it? Invade their privacy. They don't know what to say. They don't know how to behave. I mean, there are exceptions to this, but generally speaking, it's not a institution, so to speak, as it is in Judaism. How do you avoid that problem in Judaism? How do you keep the door open in grief so that people feel comfortable coming and visiting?
Well, people do feel comfortable in visiting because it's their time to console the family. For us, it's not necessarily the week of Shiva that's the biggest problem. After the week of Shiva is over and everybody goes away, then we're most concerned actually about the grieving family. Because you've had this enormous influx of people into your home, and then when they go and the door shuts on that 7th day, you're all by yourself. Or your family's quiet. And that's when the true friends come out and say, I'm here for you on Shiva. So the true friend during that week, Shiva means to sit, and you sit that week on, the family in mourning sits lower because they feel low. It comes from the biblical narrative of when Jacob learned of Joseph's death. Remember, he tore his garment, he covered himself in sackcloth and ash, and he sat low.
Mm-hmm.
Same tradition that we have, the sitting low. As a consequence, the good friends will say during that week of sitting, I'm here for you now, but when the Shiva is over, I will be back. I will call you during the following weeks, and we'll get together so that I'm not going to give you up or abandon you.
Mm-hmm.
I will still be here for you.
That's
So
great.
that's an important. Most rabbis are taught, go to the Shiva, but make sure you call them a month later to make sure that they're still okay. Is there anything you can do to console them, to make them feel okay?
In terms of healing, it's, in my experience, been that the whole first year is difficult, particularly as you go through the first anniversary of the person's birthday, of the anniversary of their marriage, Christmas, or
Any life cycle event or holiday.
Right.
Who sits in the chair? That
Yeah.
was the chair that so-and-so sat in.
Yeah. And
Who
that's-
cuts the meat, or who prepares this particular part of the meal? What do you do with the empty room? It feels empty, very empty. So how do you fill the void? How do you keep the memory alive but not be torn apart every time you're reminded about that
Yeah,
life?
We're talking here, dear viewer, about healing. We're talking about when you've had a real loss of someone you're close to. How do you participate in the healing of the people who are left behind? And
Well, you're an expert in this, Lee. I mean, you spent so many years
I
in
have.
hospital chaplaincy, deeply involved with people in the process of healing and hopefully recovery. Your insights are probably quite keen in terms of what people experience. And of course, every individual is different as they approach their own suffering and the path to recovery.
well, I'm interested in your remarks, but I'll say one thing that often it depends on the situation, but you can't make a general rule. But there's sometimes a lot of strong anger in the people who are in grief. I had a Jewish couple that I was involved with in my first hospital, Brooklyn Methodist Hospital in Brooklyn, New York, and this man was in his 40s, I guess, or at the most early 50s, a Jewish gentleman, and he went into the hospital for a routine gallbladder operation, and for some reason, completely unanticipated, his heart stopped during the surgery. And because he was on the operating table, the doctors could open his chest up completely and massage the heart with their gloved, sterile hand. But they still, and do electric shock, but they still couldn't bring him back. And then it was my job as chaplain at that hospital to meet his wife, a Jewish lady. And when she came into the room where we had his body on the stretcher, I'll never forget what she did, because it was absolutely classic. And her emotions were just right out there in the open. And I mean, I was privileged to be there with her. And the man's name was Sam. I have no idea what his last name was. But her first words as I took her into the room when she saw her husband dead, completely unexpected, she said, quote, "Sam, how could you do this to me?" unquote. I mean, she was so honest. She was so, involved. She wasn't cool and removed, and she was just all there. And she, growled at him there for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and I thought, oh my goodness, what's going to happen now? And then all of a sudden, she stopped being angry with Sam, and she began to be very sweet with him and very tender with him. And she pulled down the sheet in his clothing a little bit from the hospital Johnny, and saw the incision where they had tried to where they tried to resuscitate him. And oh, Sam, it was just love and tenderness. And then another family member came in, and they started all over again. And this going back and forth from being
anger to
great love and tenderness. She didn't. There's so many people who don't do it that way. I remember I had a taxi cab driver whose wife died unexpectedly one time, and I took him into his wife's room, and she was in her hospital bed. It was not a dramatic operating room situation, and he just took one look at her, and he turned around and ran out of the building. He didn't hold her hand, he didn't kiss her, he didn't talk to her, he didn't ask me anything, he didn't talk to the doctor who was with me. He just
overwhelmed by the experience.
overwhelmed. He just ran out of the building. So there are different responses that people have, but I've never forgotten this woman's reaction to her husband, because it was so honest, so open, so in touch with her feelings. And she was able to have the freedom within herself to express her feelings as she changed in her attitude.
It's clear that we can speak about healing on an individual level, and I know that there are certain clergy people who speak about healing on a national level, I should say.
Yep.
National healing. And
That's much more complicated.
it's very complicated in terms, but they try to impose, and I don't use the word in a negative sense, impose the same rubrics or the same methodologies with an individual healing to national level of healing. I mean, Jesse Jackson often speaks about healing our nation, healing the divisions that exist within our nation. You hear that quite often in social justice movements, bringing healing about in a society.
But you first have to agree that there's a problem.
This is true. This is true. But to a certain extent, for the individual, for example, when you said minimizing someone else's pain, that's crucial, because what pains you may not pain someone else.
True.
Thresholds, I've often encountered that.
It's true.
Amongst people, what their threshold happens to be. I know people who have an enormous threshold for pain. Will only go to the doctor when they can't tolerate it anymore. And their toleration might have been well beyond the toleration of another individual who just momentarily feels an ache or a pain and runs to see the doctor. So there is that whole issue of what is tolerable and what isn't tolerable. And so we can certainly talk about that. We can talk about what societal obligation is in terms of someone else's healing, but we can also talk about that within terms of individuals. Healing isn't always about taking the hand and squeezing it gently and patting someone on the back. Sometimes healing is, you've been in that bed and the doctor said you've got to move about, and I know it hurts every time you get out of the bed and try to move about, but if you ever want to get the use of that new hip and you don't want to be confined to the bed or a wheelchair, you're going to have to get up and endure the pain that I know you're going to feel when you do this. And that friend who literally causes that individual pain in the hope that the pain will diminish and the mobility will increase has to be less than the loving, tender, sweet hand. Sometimes has to be the little bit of a prod,
Tough love, we would call it.
cattle prod, for that healing to take place.
Yeah.
So healing is, the difficulty about talking about whether in the general community or the larger sense, national healing or individual healing, is that it's very situation specific, very situation specific, and one size doesn't always fit all. I have some people that I can talk to that I would be fired for by speaking to someone else that same way. But you have to know how to talk to individuals in certain situations, and even when those situations are exactly the same, one individual responds differently than another individual.
I'd like to interrupt us for a moment and encourage our viewers to phone in, please. We're talking here today with Rabbi James Glazier, and he's the rabbi at Temple Sinai here on Swift Street in South Burlington. We're talking about healing and the different aspects of healing. Please call us. I know many of you are enjoying the program, but we would enjoy it some more if you would call us and we would get your input. So please call. We're at 264-2255. 264-2255. We're not asking you to phone in as to how much money you want to offer, what your contribution would be. We just want your wisdom, your critical thought, your ideas, your experience. That's what we're looking for. So no charge. So please call us at 264-2255. Thank you.
You spoke about visiting people in the hospital, and I do a good deal of visiting in the hospital, and over the years, it's quite interesting the relationship you have with the person you're visiting. Sometimes it's what we call a cold visit. You don't know the person.
Mm-hmm.
You just see that they're from your faith community, not even necessarily of your congregation, and you pay them a visit. And I'm always quite taken back when I go in and I visit someone who doesn't necessarily know me, and they'll be sometimes quite alarmed, totally alarmed. I can recall a couple of times when someone said, "Am I that sick?" And I said, "I assure you, your doctor hasn't sent me. I'm only here because I visit all the Jews on this particular day in the hospital, and I just thought I'd drop in and see how you were doing, whether you're doing okay, whether you have people visiting you, whether your family's in touch with you, how is your healing going?" And sometimes I have to allay their fears that they're doing okay, that I wasn't being sent by a physician. I can recall once, I usually knock, listen for a response, stick my head through the door, and introduce myself, because it is their space. Their room is their space.
Absolutely.
And I'm a guest in their room. I'm not, I'm not like the technician who's going to draw blood, who just marches in, "Let me have your arm." And so I ask, "May I please come and see you? I'm Rabbi Glazier. Would you like a visit?" In my first year in the rabbinate, which I happened to be an assistant rabbi in Birmingham, Alabama, I went to a room. I made myself known to the nurses station. I asked to visit the patient. They said, "Well, go ahead and ask." I stuck my head in the door. I introduced myself, and a slipper missed me by about 2 inches, my head by about 2 inches. And I just pulled my head back immediately, and I said, "I see you don't want a visitor right now. Maybe some other time. I hope you're better. Goodbye." I'll never forget that. It's just that whoosh, right past your face, that slipper.
Sometimes people do that because they feel God's to blame that they're in the hospital and that they're sick, and we represent God, so somehow it's our fault.
We didn't get into it that deep.
Do you want to talk a little bit about healing as it's viewed in the Hebrew scriptures or Hebrew Jewish tradition? Some key themes there that might be both interesting and helpful, personally helpful to our viewers.
Well, biblical theology is, I'd like to think that biblical theology is something that, as a progressive Jew, we've moved a little bit further away from. Because there is an element of the evil ones suffer and the good flourish.
Yeah, there's that theme in the Psalms.
Right. And the reason we need to move away from that to a very large extent is we all know individuals, loving individuals, blessed individuals, who suffer. And that there are those who have dedicated their lives to family, to work, to acts of loving kindness, and who die. And I would find it impossible to accept the theology that said they died because they must have done something wrong, that Jobian kind of philosophy. I can't be a rabbi within that context. Now we know that that theology still exists amongst us, even though most of us would say, oh, I don't subscribe to it. We know it does. How many people find it difficult to talk to a friend who has contracted a disease for no fault of their own? You know, this person must have done something wrong. I don't want to see them. I could get what they have just being in proximity to them. All sorts of superstitions enter in, all kinds of, how shall I say, biblical theologies enter into that relationship, which is just absurd, absolutely absurd. Our ancestors did not have a deeper understanding about the workings of biology or the physiology, and they needed to make a world understandable. However, the one component from, or not the only one, but one component of Bible that gives great comfort, at least as far as I'm concerned, is that if you believe in a creator God, then God creates the possibility for bringing about healing. In other words, healing, as I mentioned when the show began, can come from so many different places. From professionals, from non-professionals, from friends, from neighbors, from just moments of unexpected kindness. Healing is quite possible. If you believe in a God, a creator God, a God that wants us to do well, not only to succeed materially, but also to do well in a spiritual sense, then I believe that praying to God can be a great source of comfort for individuals. I'm often reminded when I'm asked to say a prayer, I often say a prayer that goes essentially like this. I ask God to be with the person in need of healing, to give them courage to face the difficult days that lie ahead. And I also ask God to instill in the doctors great skill and wisdom, the ability to be cunning and focused in their work. I ask the nurses to be compassionate and present. I ask the family to be omnipresent and sensitive and loving. And in a sense, all of these individuals are part of God's creation. So when we pray to God for these things, we're also praying to ourselves as instruments of God to bring about the healing that so many people require. I think oftentimes, not only are we isolated from one another, we're also, to a very large extent, compartmentalized in that isolation. In other words, I send my loved one to the hospital, the hospital will heal my loved one. The nurse might say, I gave the chart to somebody, he should take it from here. And so we've compartmentalized that patient or that individual, when in fact we're in connection to one another. That healing comes not because we pass the ball to the next person necessarily, but because we carry it to the next person, and in conjunction with others, we bring about healing. Healing doesn't happen because I got the pill from the pharmacist. Healing happens because there's a whole chain of events that allows healing to take place. But we would love to compartmentalize as well. I pay my fee, I get my prize, you know, I get my reward. And it doesn't always work that way. We know that when we teach kids in school. They can go to school, but if there isn't a loving home to which they return, and there are interested parents to make sure they do their homework, and that they're good models in the neighborhood for them, and if learning is a part of everybody's existence in that community or that home, then the child will flourish. It's very difficult to raise children, intelligent, learning children, in an environment that it's not conducive. It's very difficult to have healing in an environment that's very destructive or disengaged or isolated or compartmentalized. You know, you can heal all by yourself, but it might take longer, and it might be much more painful than it needs to be.
So healing is a corporate activity, not just an individual activity.
For most of us, yes. I mean, the silent sufferer is the silent sufferer. He or she suffers silently, and what's the good of that? It's a wonderful community. Vermont is a very caring community, by the way. I often think of how blessed we are in this environment where people honestly do care. I did many a hospital visit in Washington. I've been on sabbatical for 6 months. Your viewers probably don't know that. And I served as a rabbi in residence. And Washington is the quintessential corporate environment where everything is departmentalized.
This was a big synagogue.
It was a huge synagogue. And I always found it remarkable when I went to visit someone in the hospital that someone was coming to see them in the hospital, that they were overwhelmed that someone from the synagogue of some 3,400 families, that one of the rabbis, one of 5 rabbis, would be willing to come and visit someone in the hospital. And I said, well, what do you think we do with our day? If not to visit you, then
read scripture. That's
what
all.
else will we be doing? Bikor cholim, visiting the sick. This is our job. This is what we are missioned to do. And they were always so overwhelmed. And not to discredit Burlington by any means, but when I visit people in the hospital in Burlington, they assume I'm going to visit them. It's a given, which I think is a much better, it's not that I'm feeling underappreciated by no means, but it's assumed that that's part of a cleric's duty to go visit the sick.
And to somehow ferret out that somebody is in the hospital and needs help, even though they don't call you and tell you.
I wish they would. It is, I'm not a seer.
No. Look in your crystal ball and see who's in the hospital, who's in need.
We beg our congregants to please let us know if they know of anyone hospitalized. It makes our job so much easier.
That's true in Christian churches as well.
The day after they leave the hospital is not the time I want to go visit the patient in the hospital. But that often happens, quite often happens. I didn't want to bother you. I didn't go in for anything that major. But it is really a great help when we do, for all clergy, by the way, when there are interested family members or friends that just drop a line at the church or synagogue to let us know that someone's in the hospital. Well, it's an amazing area. By the way, I couldn't let the show come near its conclusion without mentioning that there are a disproportionate number of Jews in the healing professions, and I don't know if you've ever noticed that, Lee.
Explain that a little bit, if you would. You mean there are more Jews
Per capita.
per capita?
There are more Jews in the healing professions than any other ethnic or religious group.
I think that's generally true. Did somebody actually figure that out?
Oh, it's a given. I mean, it's just a known given that that's true. I mean, if you, on a per capita basis.
Well,
So are you going to ask me why that's the case?
well, I sometimes say this to my Jewish friends, and I say, well, you are the chosen people.
I don't know that it's the chosenness that makes Jews enter the healing arts, healing professions, but they are there, overrepresented, by the way, in psychiatry and medicine, well, medicine and psychiatry, counseling, social work.
Yeah.
The reason being is that we very much feel that to bring wholeness to the world, shalom, comes from the word shalom, which means a wholeness. That word has a lot of meanings. Hello, goodbye, peace. But peace means that there's wholeness. So when someone says, I don't feel whole, I don't feel complete,
Mm-hmm.
shalom is the opportunity to bring that wholeness, that completeness to an individual. And so you'll often find people who are in need of healing saying, I wish I could feel the way I used to feel. I wish I could get back to the way I used to feel. And so if you ask them, what was it about the way you used to feel that makes you want to return to it? Because I felt right, I felt whole. And so that word shalom, we're very committed to that, to make the world whole again. I'm sure other people in the show have used the word tikkun olam, to repair the world. And so you really repair the world person by person. It's very difficult to bring collective wholeness. It's much easier to bring individual wholeness, person by person by person by person. And so suffering is something that really pains us as a people. I'm well aware of current circumstances in the Middle East, but it doesn't give us any joy as Jews to see anyone in pain or anguish. And I think there is within the community a real need to bring about healing when there is pain. And that's why many Jews enter the healing professions.
I wish I had an answer to your question. I have no cut and dried question. I mean, I agree with you. Personally, my own interpretation, I think, is that Jews, in my experience, are interested in education.
Mm-hmm.
They're interested in service to people. The human values are high on the list, and I don't know. Those are my thoughts, and that's what would lead them to the helping professions.
There was also, for example, the physician didn't have to have land. He wasn't land-based.
Mm.
His profession went wherever he went. All he needed was a satchel of his professional equipment, and he could do his work. And at certain times in our history, being landless required us to use intellect more than brawn. It wasn't the field you were working, it was the hands and the mind.
Yeah. And I think families, Jewish families, have encouraged their kids in that direction.
It was always considered a noble profession.
Yeah.
To be a person bringing about someone else's full potential.
Are there other final thoughts you want to express, or questions you want to ask?
Well, you can't help but enter your own thoughts and experiences into such a discussion as this.
Of course.
And
there's nothing wrong with that.
no, not at all. But it brings to mind that when I have been in situations requiring personal healing, I have found great comfort from my extended family, which is congregation. At times, it's easy to become angry and lose patience. Why does it still hurt? It shouldn't hurt this long. The hurt should have gone away. The pain should have gone away. And to be patient is something that is very difficult.
For anyone.
For anyone. It can be difficult for the person in pain. It can be difficult for the person who's providing the comfort. Why doesn't the pain go away for them already? I can't bear hearing their suffering anymore. And patience is an enormous component of a healing process. And then there's also what I would consider the recognition of the limitations of the healing process. In other words, how much better will I become? And am I able to accept who I am after healing takes place? Because who knows whether you will return to that shalom, that wholeness you had previously. Can you accept shalom in a new framework? Can you redefine yourself in such a way so that you do not lose your own sense of self-worth? Again, I use the example of God creative world. In other words, if this is part of God's creation, then it has value. Everything in God's creation has value. And not to minimize the individual, to not dehumanize the person who isn't functioning to the fullest extent of their ability, or not of their abilities, but of their capacity. And again, in our society, we have a tendency of being so product-oriented. Every time you turn on the news now, it seems that our financials drive our society much more than anything else drives our society.
Yeah.
Our gross national product, which has become a sick obsession in this country, how much productivity we can squeeze out of people, seems to be an obsession beyond belief. It drives our stock markets, it drives our factories, it drives our shopping habits, and unfortunately it drives our perception of the value of the human individual, when in fact that human individual has inherent value outside whether he or she is part of the gross national product.
That's right. For sure. We were created not just to push up the gross national product. I think healing, there's another maybe aspect of healing, is that to become our full selves is part of healing, not just because we're ill sometimes, but healing in terms of where are we going to go in terms of our own personal formation, our personal self-knowledge, personal love, personal relationship with others. Where is the raw material of our humanity going to lead us, and how will that raw material be healed? As you said earlier, you know, we've all been hurt, we've all had wounds. How are we going to seriously let those wounds be healed and become the person we were meant to be?
Hopefully they'll make us stronger and better and more compassionate.
Our time is up. We've been talking here with Rabbi James Glazier of Temple Sinai here in South Burlington on the whole subject of healing. What is healing all about from the Jewish point of view, from a human point of view? And it's been good to discuss this with you, Jim.
Thank you, Lee. It's always a pleasure.
Well, welcome back to the community, for having been down in Washington, D.C.
Thank you.
It's nice to have you.